Welcome back to the deep dive. We are back with a stack of sources that are usually about, complex history or maybe the latest tech trends, but today we're doing something a little different. I want to talk about time travel.
Time travel. That's a pretty bold way to sell a grammar discussion.
I know. But hear me out. We're tackling the timeline of our lives in English. We're looking at the specific quick guide from our source stack that focuses on two incredibly small, innocent-looking words that cause a massive amount of headache for anyone learning English, since and for.
Ah, yes. The classic duo. Calling it time travel isn't actually that far off. These aren't just prepositions. They are like the tools we use to organize our personal history. They control how a listener perceives your past and how it connects to your present.
Exactly. And the mission for this deep dive is pretty specific. We want to permanently cure the confusion between these two. Because looking at the guide and the listener data we have, it seems like even advanced beginners, people who are otherwise fluent, still just kind of flip a coin here. They guess.
And that's the problem. It's the good enough trap.
Yeah.
You say, I have lived here since 5 years, and people understand you, technically. But it sounds wrong. It sounds off. Our goal today is to move you, the listener, from guessing to knowing. We want to fix the internal logic so you never have to think about it again.
I love that. No more guessing. To do that, we're going to follow the structure of our source material very closely. We've got 3 very specific practical scenarios where this confusion happens constantly. Living situations, learning skills, and personal relationships.
These are the big 3, the trinity of time, if you will. If you can master the logic in these 3 contexts, you've basically mastered the rule for everything.
So let's unpack this. Scenario number 1. This is probably the most common conversation starter in the world. Residency, where you're living and how long you've been there.
Right. It's the classic tell me about yourself question.
The source gives us a specific example sentence. I have lived here. And then we have to choose how to finish that thought. Let's start with since. The guide defines since in a very specific visual way.
It does. And this is the key insight for the entire episode, really. The guide says, since answers the question, from when?
From when? Okay.
The example provided is, I have lived here since 2020. Now, I want you to visualize a calendar on a wall.
Okay, I'm looking at the calendar.
Since is a pin. You take a push pin and you stick it into the date 2020. That's it. You aren't measuring anything. You aren't counting days. You are simply marking the starting line. The source is very clear. Since identifies the starting point of an action or situation.
So it's static. It's just a dot on the map.
Precisely. It's the moment the key turned in the lock for the first time. It's the origin story.
Okay, that's a helpful visualization. The pin. Now let's contrast that with for. The source gives us the counterpart example. I have lived here for 5 years.
And here is where the logic shifts completely. If since is a pin on a calendar, for is a bucket that you are filling up with water. The guide says for answers the question, how long? We're measuring volume here. We're measuring duration. 5 years isn't a spot on the calendar. You can't point to 5 years on a wall. It is an amount of time that you have accumulated.
That is a really critical distinction. Volume versus location. Pin versus bucket. Now the source explicitly links both of these examples to a specific verb tense. The present perfect. I have lived. We need to talk about this because this is usually where the grammar headache starts. Why is that connection so important in this guide?
This is the bridge concept. If you just said, I lived here, past simple, what does that imply to you?
I lived here. It implies I moved. I don't live there anymore. Maybe I lived there back in 2010.
Exactly. It's a closed chapter. But the source emphasizes that since and for are often used with the present perfect. I have lived. Because we're describing an action that started in the past, in 2020. But, and this is the crucial part, it is still true right now. You are still standing in the living room of that house.
The timeline is unbroken.
Correct. The bridge is still standing.
Okay, so here is where it gets interesting for our listeners who are maybe at that intermediate B2 level. It feels like there is a nuance here in choosing which one to use. If both are grammatically correct, I can say since 2020 or for 5 years and mean roughly the same thing. How do I choose? Is it just random?
It's never random.
Yeah.
That is the B2 insight from the source material. It's about choosing your psychological focus. When you use since, you're highlighting the anniversary. You're pointing back to that origin story. Since 2020 feels like you're anchoring yourself in history. It feels a bit Nostalgic, maybe.
Versus for.
When you use for, you're emphasizing the commitment, the weight of the time. For 5 years sounds like you're presenting a receipt. Look at all this time I've invested. So for the learner, don't just ask which is correct. Ask, what do I want the listener to feel? The start date or the endurance.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about the vibe you want to give off. But even with that insight, people slip up. The guide alludes to this, and we hear it all the time. What's the common error trap here regarding living situations?
The trap is mixing the logic types. A learner might say, I have lived here since 5 years.
Since 5 years, I feel like I have heard that a million times. It almost sounds right if you don't think about it.
It's extremely common, especially for speakers of Romance languages, where one preposition might do double duty. But based on our source, why does that fail? Go back to the visualization.
Well, because 5 years is the bucket. It's the volume. You can't put a start pin into a volume.
Exactly. You cannot start since a quantity. You can only start since a point. Since 5 years is like saying, I'll meet you at 5 gallons. It just doesn't compute logically.
That's a great way to put it. I'll meet you at 5 gallons. Okay, let's move to scenario 2. This one hits close to home for anyone listening to this deep dive because it's about education and skill building. The example in the source is about studying English.
Right. And this scenario introduces a slightly different variable. In the first scenario, we had numbers, 2020. 5 years, very mathematical here. Things get a little fuzzier.
So, looking at the since rule again, the example is, she has studied English since she was a child.
Yes, since she was a child.
Now, she was a child isn't a number. Does that complicate the rule? Because you can't find child on a calendar in the same way you can find January 1st.
It complicates it slightly, but the logic holds up. And that's a key takeaway from the guide. A point in time doesn't have to be a digit. Childhood is still a specific era in the past. It serves as the starting gun. So, since she was a child is perfectly valid because it still answers that fundamental question. From when?
From when? From the time of being a child. Okay. And then for the for rule, the source gives us. She has studied English for a long time.
For a long time. I love this example because a long time is incredibly vague. How long is a long time? 10 years, 50 years.
That's subjective.
But grammatically, it follows the exact same logic.
Yeah.
It is a duration. It's a bucket of time. Even if we don't know exactly how big the bucket is, it answers how long. Therefore, we must use for.
And again, we're seeing this connection to the present perfect. She has studied.
Yes. The studying began back then in childhood. And the implication is that she's still studying now. The structure holds that entire timeline together. If you said she studied English, past simple, it sounds like she quit.
Right. She studied English when she was a child, but now she speaks only French.
Exactly. The present perfect keeps the skill alive.
So for that intermediate learner, the B2 insight here seems to be about how we visualize time when it's not a number. It requires a bit of mental gymnastics.
That's right. When you're moving up to that next level of fluency, you stop translating word for word and you start visualizing. Since requires you to look back over your shoulder to the beginning. You're looking at the starting line. Since childhood, you're pointing backwards.
For
requires you to calculate the distance between then and now. Even if that distance is just a long time, you are looking at the stretch of road, not the starting line.
I like that. Looking at the start versus looking at the stretch of road. Now, what about the error trap here? I imagine it's similar to the first one, but with these phrases, it gets tricky.
The dangerous error here, and it sounds really clunky to a native ear, is saying something like, she has studied English for she was a child.
Oof. For she was a child. Yeah, that sounds broken.
It sounds like you're trying to give a reason, like for she was a jolly good fellow. It doesn't sound like time.
Why does that break the logic?
Because she was a child is a specific event or state. It's a point. You cannot measure how long with this single event. You can't say, I did this for Tuesday. You have to say, since Tuesday, she was a child is the Tuesday of her life, so to speak. It's the point.
You can't have a duration that is just a single point. You need 2 points to make a duration.
Exactly. And 4 needs that duration.
All right, we are breezing through this. Let's go to scenario 3. This one is perhaps the most personal. It's about relationships and connection. The source gives us the phrase, we have known each other.
This is a great one because it uses a state verb to know.
Right. This is where people get tripped up. I've heard people say, I am knowing him.
Which is a whole other deep dive. But for our purposes, we stick to the present perfect. We have known.
So let's look at the since example. We have known each other since last year.
Since last year. Again, simple, clean. Last year is the timestamp, is the mark on the calendar.
And the for example. We have known each other for 2 months.
For 2 months. Here we see the precision again. 2 months is the calculated length of the relationship bucket.
Now, I want to press on the state verb thing. Does the rule change here? Because we aren't doing anything. Living is an action. Studying is an action. Knowing is just existing. It feels passive.
That is a very common confusion, but the source implicitly shows us that the rule does not change. Even with feelings or knowledge or possession, these things that are states, the rules of present perfect plus a time expression remain identical. If the state started in the past and continues to now, you use the same since and for logic.
So, I have loved chocolate since 1990 follows the same rules as I have lived here since 1990.
Precisely. The grammar doesn't care if it's an action or a feeling. It only cares about the geometry of the time.
Let's get to the B2 insight for this one. The guide has a section called Simple Difference, where it contrasts Monday and 2 days.
Yes, since Monday versus for 2 days.
This feels like the key to unlocking the whole puzzle for an intermediate learner. It strips away all the other words.
It does. This is where you stop translating in your head. You have to start seeing the difference between a point and a period. The guide explicitly says, use since for the start of a period. Use for the length of a period.
So if I meet someone and I want to tell them how long we've been friends, I have a choice. I'm the director of the movie.
Right. If you want to emphasize the day you met, that specific moment of connection, the spark you use since the conference, since we met, since 2015, it frames the relationship around its origin.
But if I want to show off?
If you want to emphasize the amount of time you've invested in that friendship, the endurance of it, you switch to for. We have been friends for 10 years. It adds weight.
It's subtle, but it adds flavor to what you're saying. Now, hit us with the common error trap for relationships. I have a feeling I know what it is.
You probably do. The slip up here usually sounds like this. We have known each other since 2 months.
Since 2 months. Again, I can see why people say that. They're thinking, well, the relationship started 2 months ago. They're thinking about the start, so they grab the word since.
Exactly. Their intent is correct. They were thinking about origin. But the grammar tool they picked up is wrong. 2 months is not a date. You cannot find 2 months on a calendar. You can find January or February, but 2 months is a length. Therefore, logically, it requires for.
You can't make an appointment on 2 months.
Exactly. I'll see you on 2 months makes no sense.
Okay, we have covered the 3 scenarios: living, learning, and knowing. I want to pull this all together. The source guide has a section called Simple Difference, which we touched on, but let's boil it down to the absolute basics.
Let's do it.
If a listener takes away nothing else from this deep dive, if they forget the bucket and the pin, what is the golden rule?
The golden rule, straight from the source, is this. Since equals a point in time, it is the start. For equals a period of time, it is the duration.
Point versus period. Start versus duration.
If you remember, since from a point, for equal during a period, that is the mantra.
I promised an analogy earlier, and I want to try this out on you. Imagine a race, like an Olympic sprint.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Usain Bolt is on the blocks.
Since is the starting line gun going off. Bang. That moment, the smoke in the air. That is since. Since the gun went off.
I like that. It's instant. It's a singular event.
And 4 is the stopwatch ticking while you're running. It's counting the seconds, the minutes, the sweat accumulating. It's the run itself.
That's perfect. Since the gun went off versus for 20 seconds, it perfectly captures the logic. One is an event. The other is a process.
Now, why does this matter? Aside from passing a grammar test or a TOEFL exam, why should our listeners care about getting this right?
It matters because fluency isn't just about vocabulary. It's about signaling. When you use these correctly, you are signaling to a native speaker that you understand the flow of time in English. Specifically, you understand the present perfect.
It's a credibility signal.
It is. When you mix them up, it creates a little speed bump in the conversation. The listener has to pause and do the math for you. Wait, do they mean 5 years ago or 4 or 5 years? It takes them out of the moment. When you get it right, the conversation just flows. It removes the friction.
It makes you a more effective storyteller of your own life. You aren't forcing your listener to translate your timeline.
Exactly. You are handing them the timeline clearly.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We have taken apart the guide, looked at the examples, visualized pins and buckets, and hopefully cleared up the confusion.
I think we have.
My challenge to you, the listener, is to look at your own life today. Look at your job. Look at your hobbies. Look at your relationship. Try to frame them using both sentences. I have worked here since, and I have worked here for. Feel the difference in your mouth.
And here's a thought to leave you with, something to mull over. If we change our perspective from since, which is always looking back at the past, at the ghosts of who we were, to for, which is looking at the volume of time we hold right now, does it change how we feel about our experiences? Does saying, I've been married since 2010 feel different than saying, I've been married for 15 years? One emphasizes the history, the other emphasizes the endurance.
That is a fascinating thought. Are you a historian of your life, or are you looking at the weight of your experience? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of time and grammar.
It was a pleasure.
See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. See you next time.